The full story first.
I saw police being forceful, pushing young men and women to the ground as they made almost 100 arrests. Will the cold affect your voters?
Well, we have a lot of tremendous support.
Free, wherever you get your news.
The people here know that worse storms may well be on their way.
I'm Martha Kellner and I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Los Angeles.
Tonight, survivors remember the horrors of Auschwitz 80 years on. On the anniversary of the camp's liberation, the message from survivors: hatred only begets more hatred, killing more killing. And Charles III becomes the first British monarch to set foot at the site of Auschwitz as he makes a deeply personal pilgrimage. I'll be joined by the comedian and author David Baddiel, who tells me about the lessons he says we should take from history and the generational trauma that's affected his family. Also tonight, Chancellor Rachel Reeves speaks to Labour MPs ahead of her big speech this week on growth. She's warning she's going to push further and faster on boosting the economy, but are they all behind her? After Donald Trump says Keir Starmer has done a very good job so far, we'll ask if the Prime Minister's done a very good job of keeping him on side. And as the government looks to recruit a photographer to work with Ed Miliband at his Department for Energy and Net Zero, we'll take a closer look at the job ad. Bringing the energy to the studio tonight, James Starkey and Emily Thornberry, who'll be with us for the next hour. It's Monday, I'm Sophy Ridge live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. Hello, good evening. Well, throughout the day, events have been taking place to mark the 80th anniversary of Holocaust Memorial Day and the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau by Soviet troops. At least 6 million Jewish people were killed in the Holocaust, more than 1 million of them at Auschwitz. And early today, around 50 survivors took part in a service of commemoration. They were joined by King Charles and world leaders. The ceremony began with photos set to music by a German Jewish composer. Now, the last time anyone saw James Simon, he was sitting on a suitcase on a railway platform, jotting down a few thoughts for a piece of music. He then boarded a train to Auschwitz, where he was killed in a gas chamber. On a freight train car, a symbol of the 80th anniversary of the liberation of the German Nazi concentration and extermination camp, was placed directly in front of the main gate of Auschwitz-Birkenau, where the service took place. The journalist and historian Marian Tursky, who's now 98, was sent to Auschwitz in 1944 and survived the westward death march in 1945. He spoke at the ceremony earlier.
There's always been a very small minority of us who went through all those selections positively. That number itself was very little. And those who lived to see freedom, there were hardly none. So few. And now, there is only a handful. Such a small bevy. That is why I believe that our thoughts should now go towards this huge majority, those millions of victims who will never tell us what they experienced, what they felt, just because they were consumed by that mass destruction.
Well, the King has become the first serving British monarch to visit Auschwitz, where more than 1 million people, mainly Jews, were murdered at the hands of Nazi Germany. Earlier, King Charles visited the Jewish Community Centre in Krakow, where he met Holocaust survivors and also heard from volunteers and members about the centre's mission to rebuild Jewish life in the city. The King used his address at the event to highlight how the world today remains full of turmoil and strife, and how remembering the events of the past is a responsibility that everyone must take.
To be in Poland on International Holocaust Remembrance Day, as we commemorate 80 years since the liberation of Auschwitz, is both a sombre and indeed a sacred moment. As the number of Holocaust survivors regrettably diminishes with the passage of time, the responsibility of remembrance rests far heavier on our shoulders and on those of generations yet unborn. The act of remembering the evils of the past remains a vital task, and in so doing we inform our present and shape our future.
And the Prince and Princess of Wales also attended commemorations at the Guildhall in central London, meeting faith and civic leaders. William and Kate met and spoke to Holocaust survivors, and the Prince of Wales then lit a candle and gave a reading. The Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, also attended the Holocaust Memorial Day UK national ceremony, and he said, earlier this month, my wife and I were in Block 27 of Auschwitz, searching for members of her family in the Book of Names. It was harrowing. We turned page after page after page just to find the first letter of a name. It gave me an overwhelming sense of the sheer scale of this industrialised murder. But as we remember, we must also act, because we say never again, but where was never again in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur, or the acts of genocide against Yazidi? Today, we have to make those words mean more. So we will make Holocaust education a truly national endeavour. It's a duty for all of us to make never again finally mean what it says. Never again. We can speak now to our Europe correspondent, Siobhan Robbins, who is in Auschwitz for us. Siobhan, what have you been looking at today?
Hi, Sophie. Just a remarkable and moving day. As you've heard throughout the day and at the start of your programme, we heard from witnesses, survivors of one of the greatest crimes in history, giving testimony in front of world leaders, but also families of those who died, and everyone in that tent who returned to Auschwitz to remember the journey that they made and being liberated 80 years ago, held in their hearts those who didn't make it, because many of the people that we've spoken to and heard from came with family members, and some of those family members were murdered on arrival. For example, I spoke to a 99-year-old man who got to Auschwitz with his brother and sister. They were selected and put in different groups, and his parents were sent straight to the gas chamber. And that process of selection haunts many of the people who came back here. And we saw this morning 50 survivors laying wreaths at the death wall, that wall in Auschwitz main camp where I am now, where many prisoners were shot. And they put their hands onto the stones where innocent blood was spilt, really reaching out to those loved ones who are no longer here. And that is the message from today. After all of the emotion, the tributes, the speeches, the message is that we really cannot ever forget. And that responsibility, as King Charles said, is really now with the next generations. We carry that on our shoulders to ensure that we pass down the memories of the Auschwitz survivors who say themselves they don't know how much longer they'll be able to keep coming back and making this journey. So it's our responsibility, according to King Charles, to pass that down to the next generation and keep on passing it down so that memory doesn't die out.
Yeah, such an important message and such an important responsibility. Siobhan, thank you so much for speaking to us today from Auschwitz. Well, as Siobhan was saying, the responsibility of remembering the horrors of Auschwitz, confronting what it means for us all as what humans are capable of, and then to try and make sure that never again really means never again, is something that I'm sure we'll all be thinking about today. Earlier, I spoke to the comedian and author David Baddiel. Among his many works that he's written, Jews Don't Count was one of them, an examination of anti-Semitism in modern Britain. So I asked him for his reflections on the significance of today. You've written very movingly about your own family's, you call it intergenerational trauma that you experienced from the Holocaust. So it feels like that really is the place to start with that story, because before the war, before the Holocaust, your mother, her parents had a pretty comfortable life in Germany. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah. So my grandparents on my mother's side were sort of semi-aristocratic, I guess. I mean, they were industrialists. My grandfather owned a brick factory in a place called Königsberg, which was in East Prussia. Due to the war, that's actually now Kaliningrad. It's not even part of Germany anymore, but it was this incredible city. Educational university city where Immanuel Kant was from. And they had a brick factory there, and when I've seen pictures, they had like this incredible society wedding. And yeah, then they lost everything. And when I wrote a book recently, a memoir, and actually I didn't know just how near the wire they came with never making it out. I always knew it was late. I always knew they didn't actually get out. and come here until kind of August 1939, which is unbelievably close, obviously, to the war and to the stopping of emigration from Germany of Jews. But there are letters to the British Refugee Committee, the Anglo-Jewish Refugee Committee that was helping Jews, that essentially say, if you don't make it now, that's it. And then my mum was born in March 1939, which made it really, really difficult. So yeah, that's what happened. And then in terms of intergenerational trauma, I mean, it's such a complicated subject. They got here, they'd lost everything, most of their family was murdered. My grandfather was also interned on the Isle of Man, along with many other German Jewish refugees. He then became clinically depressed after the war. And what I write about a bit is how the intergenerational trauma is not straightforward, because my mum was a very extraordinary woman and, you know, was very transgressive and crazy in a way that I kind of celebrate, but clearly has something to do with the idea of this life that she never got to lead.
I can't really kind of get my head around what it must have been like with the baby, your mother, to be leaving everything and the risk. And then you mentioned there about your grandfather being interred, because I think that was something that sort of surprised me as well, because you think of it, in many ways, of course it is, a very sort of proud part of British history, welcoming Jewish children in particular, but that wasn't quite the experience, was it, that your family had?
So to be clear, I mean, there's so many small details about the Holocaust that are maybe not understood. So one is that my grandfather was in a concentration camp before the war. So after Kristallnacht, which was in 1938, November 1938, loads of Jews, thousands of Jews, were sent to concentration camps, which were not at that time extermination camps, although still horrible, terrible places. He was in Dachau for 6 months, and they only just got him out. They basically bribed everything they had to get my grandfather out. And so then he arrives here thinking he's safe, and then in 1940, under pressure essentially from right-wing tabloids saying, what are all these Jews doing here? What are all these immigrants doing here? And the British government were at the time, for various reasons, some of them anti-Semitic, some of them political, not telling the country. The Ministry of Information wasn't telling the country why Jews were here. He just ordered the immediate internment of all Germans living in Britain in 1940, of whom 90% were Jewish refugees. So he then is on the Isle of Man, interned for 2 years. So all of that contributes to, in terms of intergenerational trauma, to the psychological trauma that my mother would have suffered as a very young child.
Can you talk to me a bit about your mother? Because she sounds kind of extraordinary.
Obviously there is tragedy and there is poignancy in the way that someone who's had those experiences might grow up, but there's also, for me, comedy. So for me, a lot of that book is about the fact that my mum had an affair with a golfing memorabilia salesman, golf that was really not a sport, that was a big deal in our house, although interestingly still mainly excluded to Jews in the 60s and 70s because Jews weren't allowed into British golf clubs, and that might be one reason why she looked there to sort of sort things out. And what I think is that my mum, if she had lived in Königsberg, would have married probably some kind of Austrian sort of prince. And the nearest thing she could find in Cricklewood in 1970 was this kind of smooth golf guy. And that's kind of poignant and funny at the same time, right? It's like, at one time it's funny, and it definitely is funny, and at another time it really tears me apart to think that when she says, you know, she said to me once this thing about, you know, I try to, you know, she talked a lot about her affair being her attempt to live an exciting life, and I think what she meant by that was the life that she'd lost.
That makes a lot of sense, actually.
Yeah.
That she's kind of thinking about the other life she could have had.
Yeah. I mean, she married my dad, right? So my dad, didn't really expect it to go like this, but the Holocaust Memorial Day conversation. But in a way, the individual stories are, that's the thing, they're all different and they're all detailed, and the specifics are really unusual and strange a lot of the time. And they're not all just straightforwardly sad with a capital S, right? Because my dad was a working class Welsh guy, and not, I think, what she would have expected. At the same time...
Not the prince, then.
Not the prince, but what you need to know about my dad, of course, is that he's Welsh, he's born in Wales, but he comes from fleeing Jewish refugees in the 19th century, who were fleeing from Cossacks and from Russian persecution. I mean, this is the thing about being... I did Who Do You Think You Are in the first series, and they always like to have a Jew in Who Do You Think You Are because they always like to have Nazis, because Nazis are basically fantastic TV. I've said it. But what I noticed when I did that, and I went to Kaliningrad, is that there's just the stumps of my grandparents' brick factory there. And when other people trace their history, it can be really intact. You know, I remember at the time thinking, Ian Hislop, right now, he's probably at the manor house that his great-great-great-grandparents lived in, and it's all completely like it was then. But if you're Jewish, your history is one of fleeing and rubble.
It's very powerful to hear that the history is one of fleeing.
Yeah.
Because it's that, I guess, really shows the racism and the persecution that Jews have suffered throughout their history.
One of the things I say, it doesn't occur to me to say anything else, but it's say my mother was a refugee, my grandparents were refugees. But it's strange, because I think in this phenomenon that I've identified about Jews not counting, is that vocabulary isn't often granted to Jews, I think.
Do you feel that there is, I guess, a blind spot among progressives, among the left, about when it comes to the discrimination and the anti-Semitism that Jews have suffered?
Well, yeah, that's my thing with Jews Don't Count, is that it's specifically about, it's not about anti-Semitism in the sort of direct way, the, as it were, traditional way that's come from the far right. It's about how the people who would consider themselves to be most concerned about discrimination, about racism, about many, many different types of marginalisation, don't apply that when it comes to anti-Semitism. They just don't apply the same language. That's a good example, I think, of how I think even calling my mother a refugee is a slightly unusual thing.
Why do you think that is?
Despite the fact that Jewish history is a huge cyclical loop of disempowerment, the lingering sense that Jews are essentially invulnerable, that there is a lack of vulnerability, that they don't quite qualify as to fit into the class of victim, means that you get this constant issue. And of course that is made much more complex by what's happening at the moment.
Do you think there's been, I guess, a rise in anti-Semitism because of the war in Gaza?
I think there's anti-Semitism exists all the time. I think unquestionably events in the Middle East are continually conflated with ideas about Jews elsewhere, which is wrong. The idea that Jews have to answer for, Jews around the world have to answer for or are considered complicit in things that happen miles and miles away is again something that is fairly unique to Jews. But I think that one of the things that needs to be understood, and in a way Holocaust Memorial Day is quite good for this, is I think that anti-Semitism is now very, very much thought of as consequent upon things that happen in the Middle East, whereas the State of Israel did not exist in the 1930s. The State of Israel was established 3 years after the war, and I hear people saying that if Israel didn't exist, then anti-Semitism would sort of go away magically, sort of forgetting that the largest global anti-Semitic event happened just before the establishment of the state. So for me, it's a kind of, unfortunately, a constant in the psyche of the West, in the psyche of everywhere where Jews are a minority, which is everywhere, except, in fact, Israel.
You have experienced anti-Semitism yourself. It feels to me like whenever you speak about anti-Semitism, you experience anti-Semitism.
Yeah. Well, I can only talk about my lived experience, but that seems specific to me about anti-Semitism as a type of racism, which is that speaking about your experience of it involves people getting furious about it. Because the way that we are asked to imagine the world sometimes now is in a very binary way, as in terms of victimisers and victimised and oppressed and oppressors. And Jews are a kind of glitch in that binary, right? Because some Jews are powerful, but Jews have also this incredibly long history of, as I say, of disempowerment, of racism and discrimination against them, which means you can't think about the world in those easy ways when you think about anti-Semitism. And the easiest thing to do, therefore, is to dismiss anti-Semitism as a real issue. To say it's not real, it's all happened years ago, it's not an ongoing thing, and anyway, it's all about the Middle East. So why is he whinging about it? That's what tends to happen. And that's because people don't want to complexify that binary. They just want to think in terms of good and evil.
Yeah, which is just a completely reductive way of looking at the world.
It's not for me to speak about other people's terrible history, other minorities' terrible history. And I think again, something that happens with the way that the Holocaust is particularly thought about is that some progressives, some far-right people, can decide this is a kind of exceptionalism, that we're giving too much space and too much highlighting to the Holocaust as opposed to any other tragedy. But actually, what needs to be understood is the specificity of the Holocaust, not necessarily prioritising it against any other tragedy or atrocity in the history of the world. It had very specific elements to it, a very specific type of mass psychosis in Germany, a politicised mass psychosis, and a very specific type of industrialisation of the process of killing. And those things are not mirrored in many, many other atrocities. And that, in a way, is why it's worth remembering, because that, in a way, does illustrate why it's the kind of darkness in humanity that we need to guard against.
Today, Holocaust Memorial Day, is there anything particular that you're going to be thinking about or remembering?
I tend to think about my great-uncle Arno, because I was quite close to my grandma, who was called Otti, and she lived in Cambridge for the rest of her life when she came here. And she spent a lot of her life trying to find what had happened to her younger brother. She went to the Red Cross after the war and tried to find out what had happened to Arno, who was her younger brother. And actually, when I was doing Who Do You Think You Are, they had found these postcards from the Red Cross, and he was in the Warsaw Ghetto, and he's written these postcards to my grandma, and they just say, "Pray for me." And I have a picture of him. I wrote a book called The Secret Purposes, which is about the internment of Jewish German refugees on the Isle of Man. It's mainly about my grandfather's life. And I didn't really know that much about Arno. And I dedicated that book to my grandparents. And then I found out, and I said to Ernst and Otti Fabian, survivors. And then I added, and to my great-uncle Arno, and didn't add the word survivor. And I think about him a lot. He looked very like a member of my family. And it's a member of my family that I never met, and I don't really know what happened to him.
How old was he roughly at the time, do you know?
He would have been in his 30s.
Yeah. So you were a young man in the Warsaw Ghetto, and then the trial, you don't know?
Well, he either died in the ghetto, he most likely died in the ghetto, but that's one thing I did want to say, actually, which is, so one of the things about Holocaust Memorial Day that I think it's worth mentioning is it's the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz and the liberation of Belsen, but there are so many other places that are not mentioned. So one of the reasons we know about Auschwitz, one of the reasons we know about Belsen is that there were survivors of Auschwitz because it was a labour camp as well as an extermination camp. And Belsen was liberated when people were starving, but the Allies managed to save some people. At Treblinka, at Sobibor, at Belzec, at Chelmno, these were totally dedicated extermination camps. Hundreds of thousands of people died there. And the reasons we don't know that is those people went straight to the gas vans or the gas chambers or the ovens or the forests to be shot. And my point is, the reason we don't know about those places, or very few people do, is there are no survivors. Yeah. Survivors are dying all the time now, the ones who did survive, so therefore the worry is we will soon not know any names.
That's the thing, isn't it? People who cannot tell their story,
yeah.
They're not here to tell it,
yeah.
Which is what happened with your relative in the Warsaw Ghetto as well.
Yeah. Well, I've tried to tell it a bit.
You have. Yeah. You definitely have, which is great.
Yeah.
But it's been really, really powerful speaking to you today.
Thank you, Sophie.
We really appreciate having you here to discuss it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
David Baddiel speaking there. Well, our duo for the evening is the former Home Office Special Advisor, James Starkey, and the Chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Emily Thornberry. It's great to have you both with us. It sort of really kind of stayed with me today, you know, hearing David Baddiel there speak about the death camps where no one survived, and so we don't know their stories. And it didn't make me think, you know, listening to some of the survivors today, how it may not be that long before there aren't people still alive to tell their stories about what happened, and how important it is to remember that and remember what happened and the reality of it. What have you been sort of reflecting on today?
I actually have got a number of things I've been reflecting on, so forgive me. I have a stepmother who's Jewish, whose mother was a Romanian Jew who married my stepmother's father in Vienna just before the war, and he was German, and the two of them went to Bavaria, of all places, and pretended that she was Turkish. And she survived the war by pretending to be Turkish and pretending that her daughter was Turkish. And I think when you're talking about intergenerational trauma, I think there's lots of things about my stepmother that are explained by the fact that she had to be so secretive at such an early age. And even now, prop planes, if they go by, she shakes. And she has a very odd attitude to being Jewish. And my step-grandmother was the most extraordinary, remarkable woman who, despite the fact that the uncle would come to tea and he was a Nazi, you know, in the SS, she survived just through sheer force of personality and will.
It's extraordinary.
Amazing. And then as German Jews, they came to England afterwards and weren't really received with open arms, so ended up in France.
Oh, really? You see, this is it as well. It is the reality
yes, exactly.
and the discrimination that people faced and for who they are.
Can I tell you another story, which is about my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law's family come from Poland, and they were big employers in Henley. And during the war, there was this fear, obviously, that the Germans would invade, and they were a well-known Jewish family, and it was explained to the family that if the Germans came, there was no hiding. They were on a list. Some English people would have put them on a list, but what they had done was that they'd come to an agreement with a family in Henley. I don't know to this day what that family was, but the family had agreed to take on one of the children so that the family would continue. And I wish I knew who that family was. And I speak each year to kids on this day, and I talk to Islington children and I say, would you have been brave enough? Would you have taken a Jewish child in those circumstances into your family? That's the challenge for all of us.
It literally sends a sort of shiver down my spine, like a physical reaction, because it is those questions that you were forced to confront by this. What it means to be human, what you would have done in that circumstance, the power of this. Like, I mean, David Baddiel describes it as like a mass psychosis in a country. It's challenging, but it's something that we have to confront, I feel. And James, what are your sort of thoughts?
I think, as David touched on towards the end of the interview, it's that sense, we've seen it also when we commemorate the end of the Second World War, that generation of people that are able to tell their stories directly, we're losing those people over time now. And I think that's just a connection to that time and the lessons that we need to remember that is going. And it's why, you know, I watched quite a lot of Sky's coverage today of the commemorations, and I looked and I thought, is, you know, strong bets, and the King's gone over there for the first time to Auschwitz, and I thought that is really important because losing touch with the past, and as David Baddiel said, not remembering those lessons. And, you know, we've had issues in this country with anti-Semitism very, very recently. You know, that's something that you look at and think, how do we not forget? How do we really remember those stories and move it and stop it being something that's just in a history book and dry? Because when listening to some of the stories today on Sky, you know, we've all grown up studying it in school and watching it. I hadn't heard that. You know, there's, as he said, each person's just got this individual story, which is so compelling and heartbreaking.
Right. But I think in Islington, when you talk to these kids, you know, because the kids come from all over the world and quite a lot of them will be refugees, they have their own relatively recent history. That, you know, we have Rwandans, we have people from former Yugoslavia, you know, they have similar sort of, you know, what happens when you are not seen as human but you are seen as something other.
I have a lot of friends who are Kurds, and they had that in the 80s. But I think, maybe it's for me, and I just think about my grandparents, you know, who one was in London in the Blitz and one was on D-Day. And just that kind of like loss of that generation, maybe that's just personal to me.
You were reflecting as well about an event that you went to recently as well.
Well, so we have an annual Hanukkah celebration on Islington Green, and last year the candle, you know, there's a candle that's lit to talk about, you know, going from darkness into light, and it's the traditional candle that's, you know, and we had a large one up on Islington Green and got attacked, and everyone was united in how awful that was. And then this year in the Hanukkah celebrations, there was There was nothing about Israel. There was no Israeli flag. There was nothing, you know, there were just Jewish people coming to celebrate Hanukkah. And there was a Gaza demonstration. And I thought about this quite a lot. And it's quite clear that the assumption that was being made was that if you were Jewish, you were in favour of what this far-right government was doing in Israel. And indeed, maybe there was some culpability. Mm. And that is racist. That is anti-Semitic. And there were probably people who would be appalled to be accused of that, of all. But that's the truth. And I think it needs to be called out. Because I think that in the end, you can't, just like you can't make assumptions about, oh, you're gay, you therefore must think this. Oh, you're Jewish, therefore you must think this. Oh, you're Nigerian, therefore you must think that. No. You have to take people as you find them, and you have to look at them, and you have to listen to them carefully and evaluate each person as they are.
Thank you both very much. It's such a difficult subject to speak about, and I really appreciate your reflections and contributions today. Thank you. Coming up on the Politics Hub. Rachel Reeves has tonight been telling Labour MPs that kickstarting economic growth is the government's #1 mission, but she admits it won't be easy. So can she deliver? Stay with us.
I'm Deborah Haynes, Sky Security and Defence Editor. The reality of life under Russian fire. People don't want to leave, even though help is here to evacuate them. They say they want to sort out their belongings first. It's absolute chaos. Fire, shouts the commander. There's a dash to safety, as Russian drones will be trying to find this position. We've now got to wait inside the shelter to see if there is incoming. I've been covering Russia's full-scale war since it began, witnessing the terror and the trauma.
When rockets fall, I try to hide my head under my toys.
Illustrating Ukraine's lost childhood, hopes and dreams framed by war. Conflict in the Middle East is another major focus.
An incredibly dangerous moment.
We saw the missiles streaking across the sky. We saw the intercept going up, and then we saw the explosions when the intercepts were successful. With global threats rising, I also explored defence and security in the UK and across NATO. This US aircraft carrier is operating in European waters in a deliberate show of force. This is routine training for NATO, but should Russia's war with Ukraine escalate significantly, pilots like these could be called upon to go into combat for real. Tucked away in the National Archives are some of the UK's old defence plans. The scale of this bunker underlines how seriously governments took the threat of nuclear attack and global conflict. Should allies listen to Vladimir Putin's sabre-rattling?
No, they shouldn't, and they don't.
Sky News, the full story first.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story.
I'm ready. Are you?
Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
Hello, welcome back. Well, in the last hour, the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, has been telling Labour MPs that kickstarting economic growth is this government's #1 mission. But she also said that growth would not come easy, and there are no easy routes out, i.e. not all of this is going to make you guys popular back in your constituencies. Well, to discuss this a bit further, our political correspondent Tamara Cohen was over in Parliament outside the meeting. What went on?
Well, Rachel Reeves got lots of cheers from Labour MPs. There are still a lot of them, and they're still very new and keen. But she said to them that economic growth is not going to be always easy. She said there are always reasons for the government to say no to things. This must change, she said. We need to start saying yes. And of course, this is all in the context of her giving a big speech on Wednesday in which it is speculated she may give the government's backing to expansion at Heathrow Airport, which has been a very long saga over the last few years, as well as schemes at Luton Airport and Gatwick Airport. Now, the Treasury are slightly playing down the idea that she can give the green light to putting spades in the ground, because since MPs last voted for Heathrow expansion back in 2018, nothing has happened because of the pandemic. They would need to put together a new formal proposal. The decisions on Luton and Gatwick have already been put in, but the Transport Secretary needs to approve those first. So she may just say that the government would look favourably on this expansion, but clearly that is going to cause quite a split in the Labour Party, with strong feelings on all sides. And we heard this afternoon from her cabinet colleague Ed Miliband, who, when he was leading the Labour Party, was against Heathrow expansion. And he said this, that it would have to comply with the government's carbon cutting targets. This is what he said.
We have a system in this country of carbon budgets. And so it's really important to say this. Any decisions about airport expansion take place within that framework. That is a legally binding framework passed by the 2008 Climate Change Act. And this government is committed to upholding the rule of law. So any decisions on aviation expansion must be made within that framework. And any aviation expansion will only be able to go ahead if it is consistent with our carbon budgets.
So he was trying to choose his words carefully there, but that next carbon budget, this is drawn up by the government's climate change advisors, is not coming until the end of February. So he's saying we can't make this decision yet, and that is the government's policy. So if Rachel Reeves does give a very strong signal on Wednesday that is what she wants to see, I think there will be some division in the Labour Party. We already know it's got their big opponents of this, like Sadiq Khan, the London mayor. There are a slew of Labour MPs now in West London and the home counties whose constituents are concerned about noise, concerned about the environmental impact. So if the Chancellor does announce this on Wednesday, although we know she's going to talk also about high streets and about housing and about planning, we know she's going to announce some new policies. If this is it, I think it's going to come with a bit of a fight.
OK, thanks very much, Tamara Cohen, speaking to us. Well, Heathrow and the wider growth strategy, I'm sure, to feature in tomorrow's newspapers. We'll have our extended press preview from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us will be the political editor of The Sun, Harry Cole, and the political editor of The Guardian, Pippa Creer. Right, let's bring in James and Emily again, shall we? Emily, what's your view on Heathrow? You've got a London constituency, of course.
Can I just say, I don't know what Tamara knows that I don't. She says there are still a lot of Labour MPs. There are a lot of Labour MPs for 5 years, Tamara. I certainly hope, unless you know something that I don't.
You can pick this up with Tamara afterwards, don't worry. But there's a lot more Labour MPs now, right? That's the point, isn't it? It's louder in the room, right? So, but to bring you back to Heathrow, what's your
So
take
we
on
all stood on a manifesto in which we measured whether we would agree to Heathrow or not. I think on 4 measurements. I think one was noise pollution, air pollution, carbon budgets. You know, you're only supposed to put out a certain amount of carbon each year. We're legally committed to that, and the need to go for growth. So you've got to balance those 4 things together. And Ed's right to point to the legislation that we passed that said that we would be constrained, and so. There's wild talk about another runway at Heathrow, expanding Gatwick, expanding Luton. I mean, we can't do all that within the constraints.
I'm trying to kind of piece together what you think here, and it feels to me like you're not really that keen on another runway at Heathrow. Is that fair?
I mean, I need to be persuaded, but I mean, I appreciate that we have to go for growth, but I need to be persuaded. And as I say, I think that the right approach is within those 4 checks, you know, so... those are the things that we need to consider properly and look at it in the round, not allow one aspect of this to eclipse everything else.
Broadening it out slightly, James, you know, how important is growth going to be if Rachel Reeves is going to achieve what she wants and really kind of seize the control of the economic narrative, as well as, I guess, benefiting the UK too?
I think a couple of points would be, one, it's essential. Labour have bet the house on growth. The spending and the debt that's effectively been taken on is front-loaded for the next 2 years. So in the last 3 years of the Parliament, without growth, there are serious problems in terms of investing in public service. And I assume that's the argument that the Chancellor will make and say to Labour MPs, if you want us to continue investing in public services, we're going to have to get growth and this is how you do it, and lay out a whole wreath. The other interesting thing, though, is to take some of the other points that have been trailed in the past few weeks and that we've known about for a while, for example, changing in planning rules, but the Prime Minister last week saying on taking on some of the legal challenges that big projects have faced, they're kind of interesting as well because actually if you speak to people in the Conservative Party, they're things we wanted to do, didn't do, tried to do, failed to do, and broadly support. So there are areas which the opposition will have a challenge because at heart, making it easier to build things is something that the Conservative Party, and I assume others like Reform, will think is a good idea.
So do you think that the Conservative Party should be like, yeah, that's a good idea, we'd back that?
I think broadly, yes. I think the thing they've got to push on is the proof's in the pudding. Will it happen?
Yeah.
Will these things get seen through? But anything that, you know, I mean, I don't think this is quite going as far as Liz Truss. So I'm sure Emily wouldn't think that. But I think the push for growth in some of the things that's being done are things that were partly government policy for the past few years. They just didn't get done.
Well, that's all very odd, isn't it? So as government policy, you just didn't do it. So what were you doing instead? I mean, you were getting public services into the worst state they'd ever been. You were increasing taxes to the highest level that it had ever been, and you were increasing debt to the highest level it's ever been. The only way out of this is through growth, and yet you didn't do that, but you say it was your policy. I mean, come on. You know, yes, you know, we have stood on a platform of going for growth, and we're going to do it, and we mean it. And, you know, all the homes that you say was your policy that you didn't build, we're going to build. The onshore wind that maybe you say is your policy, I'm surprised to hear that, we're going to build. You know, it means that we're going to have to rewire our electrical system. We're going to, I mean, you know, there will be upset people, but in the end, my view is that we owe it to the next generation to make sure that we grow the economy, not least because we're the generation that has all the homes and all the mortgages and everything else. We really need the next generation to have somewhere to live.
Quick thought, Jones, to come back.
Look, I would say they're fair challenges to the last Conservative government. My point would be, which I'll say is, the proof's in the pudding. Governments say they're going to do this. We've had 6 months. There's been a lot talked about. The proof will be delivery. Will these things get done? Will the policies get pushed through? Because there will be opposition the same as there was during the Conservative government. So the talk is the easy bit, is what I'm saying. The difficulty is the delivery.
All right, thanks both very much indeed. Coming up next on the Politics Hub. Ed Miliband has hired a snapper to document his net zero endeavours, paid for by the taxpayer, of course. The brief is to make wind turbines stand out on social media. We're talking crafting political images next. So welcome back to social care now, because Scotland has scrapped plans to introduce a national care service, sparking fears for the future of social care across the rest of Britain. Health Secretary Wes Streeting has unveiled plans to reform the social care system with his own vision of a national care service designed to bring it closer to the National Health Service. Well, a Sky News survey of care providers suggests councils are already cutting back, and in some cases care is being cancelled altogether. Here's Sky's Nick Martin.
You okay?
Graham and Angela Carson are among more than 1 million older people in Britain who need vital help in their own home. Graham suffers from muscular dystrophy. Angela has Guillain-Barré syndrome, which means her immune system attacks her nerves and joints. Carers are needed several times a day to help move Graham and prepare meals for them both.
Hello, it's Graham. Just want to know if the council have been on for Angela's care package.
It's a week before Christmas, and Angela has been told by her local council that she can no longer have a home carer to help her. And Graham's care package is being reduced. They're shocked.
They just said it was stopped, and I was quite independent, and this would promote my independence more. I don't see how it can. I don't know how I'm going to manage. I don't want to get upset.
Graham and Angela's care is paid for by West Lothian Council. Last November, the council publicly admitted its finances were in a mess, with an £8.1 million overspend, fuelled in part by rising social care costs. It said it needs to make savings. The Scottish Government controls social care, but we've discovered that cuts to care packages aren't just happening in Scotland, they appear to be happening across Britain too. An exclusive Sky News survey of domestic care providers across Scotland, England and Wales indicates a worrying trend of cuts to these services in the last 2 years. 83% of care providers who responded told us that their council had cut the number of care packages being paid for. Angela is now preparing meals for Graham and herself. She's doing the laundry, she's going out to do the shopping, and she's making hot drinks. Just put your hand on your heart for me. How has it been?
Terrible. I go to bed at night and that's all I can think about. I feel like I don't exist anymore. I feel if I wasn't here, it wouldn't matter.
We asked West Lothian Council for an interview, but they declined, telling us a consistent and fair approach is applied when reviewing or assessing an individual's care, with any changes to a care plan being made on the basis of assessed need and not to address financial pressures. According to Age UK, more than 2.5 million older people are left struggling because they aren't getting the care that they need. It is a cruel side effect of a broken social care system which is leaving millions suffering behind closed doors. Nick Martin, Sky News.
Still to come on the Politics Hub. Brace yourselves, Net Zero is going for a rebrand. Yes, Energy Secretary Ed Miliband is advertising for an official photographer to zhuzh up pics of windmills on his Insta. Before you say it'll never catch on, just remember, Millie fandom, stay with us.
Royals and world leaders mark 80 years since the liberation of Auschwitz. We'll bring you Susan Pollock's story. She was just 13 years old when she was taken to the camp. And we'll be joined by Rob Rinder, whose grandfather was a Holocaust survivor. Plus, a special report on the crisis in social care funding. And you can find out why one couple took a 1,000-mile detour on their journey from Cornwall to Crewe. All that and much more on the UK Tonight at 8.
I'm James Matthews, and I'm Sky's US correspondent, based here in Washington, D.C. Do you fear a fourth indictment? Does your government owe an apology to the British home children?
Great to see you.
Does your government owe them an apology? The fact that they were intercepted, Does that indicate a military weakness on the part of Iran?
No, no, no.
Free, wherever you get your news. There's no doubting the strength of this hurricane as it roars through. You can feel a devastating power. It had been a difficult night in a deadly storm.
Bang, bang. You can hear it hitting the windows.
Our houses are okay.
It's depressing. As bad as all of this is, it could have been much worse. Today, this land they call sacred is at the heart of America's electric car revolution.
To me, it's a sacred ground.
The white gold rush is a race that Biden doesn't want to lose. I've covered some of the biggest stories in the world. Donald Trump, 45th President of the United States, it would appear is about to learn his fate.
Escort coming out!
San Quentin houses America's largest death row. They rarely allow cameras onto the condemned block.
James Matthews, Sky News. I want to be treated equally like everyone else. It's one step closer to getting out, to getting off death row.
Sky News. Get the full story first. Mr. Trump, James Matthews from Sky News.
Hey, James.
Are you diminished by claims that you're a racist?
Question?
Mr. Musk, has your ignorance and ego cost Ukrainian lives? Vladimir Putin calls you outstanding. What do you call him, sir?
He's from Sky News. He's from Sky News. He's entitled to ask me questions.
That gives you the very best of Sky News wherever you are. Breaking news, videos and analysis.
Evidence of the crisis.
Podcasts, watching us live.
I'm live in Jerusalem.
Wherever you get your podcast.
All in one place and all at just the touch of a screen. The Sky News app. Get the full story first.
Hello, welcome back. Well, Ed Miliband's energy department is advertising for an official photographer to sharpen up its image. Now, the job ad promises no 2 days are alike. 1 week you might accompany a minister to a hydrogen facility, take official portraits at an international event, and refresh our stock imagery with photos from the offshore wind sector. Sounds pretty wild. So, making pics of wind turbines look attractive, can it be done? Well, here on the Politics Hub, we like a challenge. It's a new thing, isn't it? These kind of official kind of vanity photographers, we kind of call them, don't we, right? I mean, Ed Miliband's not the first, let's be honest. There's been plenty of other politicians who've dipped their toe into this, right, James?
I mean, even more than that, you know, followed around by videographers as kind of politicians. But they basically they're seeking to get round you.
Yeah, that's true.
And get straight to the electorate directly. But, it's always a bit of... it's always difficult, I think, taking interesting pictures of politicians. No offence, Emily. In that it's just you're trying to make something that the public think is quite dry look a bit more interesting, but you're also trying to avoid risks. I was always paranoid when I went into an interview with my boss because you don't want to be the person that agrees to something that makes them look bad.
Yeah.
So you're looking for signs in the background or whatever it might be.
Yeah, there's always that risk, isn't there? Like kind of the bookshelf with the bad book in the background or whatever. Are you tempted to get vanity photography of your own to follow yourself around?
I think that
maybe you've got one already.
My images on Instagram, that's at Emily Thornbury, are pretty good for politicians, actually. There are some good images there. I think we're very valuable. We're a visual society, increasingly visual society, and it is a question of how do you get messages out, I suspect. And and historically, people have always said, what is it? A picture tells 1,000 words. I think it's even just getting stronger and stronger. People get a lot of their news from social media. The younger generation definitely do, and you just have a few seconds, 5 seconds, 6 seconds to get a message across these days.
That's true.
So a good image is important, and obviously on an issue like climate change, we've got to keep the public with us because a lot of changes have got to be made.
Very on message, Emily. You can get a job in the cabinet any moment now. And thanks both very much. Great to have you on the programme this evening. Thank you. Well, that is it from us tonight. I'll see you tomorrow at 7 p.m. Up next, it is the UK Tonight with Sarah J. Mee. But I'll see you tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. Thanks for watching.
It's 8 o'clock. This is the UK Tonight. Coming up, survivors, royals and world leaders remember the horrors of Auschwitz, 80 years since the concentration camp was liberated. King Charles lights a candle of remembrance at the service in Poland, honouring more than 1 million Jewish people who were killed at the camp.
I couldn't walk. I could hardly talk. I crawled out to die.
Tonight we'll hear more from Auschwitz survivor Susan Pollack, and I'll be joined by the TV presenter and barrister Rob Rinder, the grandson of a Holocaust survivor. Also ahead tonight, the very human cost of cuts to social care. We'll bring you a special report on the impact of council cutbacks. Plus, how do you get from Cornwall to Crewe? We'll speak to the couple who found it was cheaper to fly via Spain than get the train. And a behind-the-scenes look at one of the biggest boy bands in history. We'll have the latest from the red carpet premiere of a new documentary about Boyzone. All that to come, and much more on the UK Tonight. Good evening to you. 6 million Jewish people were murdered during the Holocaust. More than 1 million of them at the Auschwitz concentration camp. Today, survivors, world leaders and royals gathered there to remember 80 years since the camp was liberated. The message from survivors: hatred only begets more hatred, killing more killing. Around the UK tonight, people are remembering too, lighting candles in their windows with buildings and landmarks lit up in purple to mark Holocaust Memorial Day, from Downing Street to Belfast, to Edinburgh and Cardiff. These illuminations, designed as a symbol both of remembrance for those people killed, for who they were and a stand against prejudice and hatred today. Well, earlier, around 50 survivors took part in a service of commemoration, which began with a series of photos set to music by a German Jewish composer. The last time anyone saw James Simon, he was sitting on a suitcase on a railway platform, jotting down a few thoughts for a piece of music. He then boarded a train to Auschwitz, where he was killed in a gas chamber. A freight train car, a symbol of the 80th anniversary of the liberation of the German Nazi concentration and extermination camp, was placed directly in front of the main gate of Auschwitz-Birkenau, where the service took place today. Author Tova Friedman spoke at the ceremony. She was brought to Auschwitz with her mother when she was just 5 years old. She warned that an atrocity like the Holocaust must never be allowed to happen again.
I'm here to talk about those who aren't here, and I'm very honored to speak to this kind of audience that has come from all over the world to mourn, remember, and honor the memory of our people who were so brutally murdered by the Nazis. However, we are also here to proclaim and to pledge that we will never, never, ever allow history to repeat itself.
The King has become the first serving British monarch to visit Auschwitz, where more than 1 million people, mainly Jews, were murdered at the hands of Nazi Germany. King Charles also visited the Jewish Community Centre in Krakow. There, he met Holocaust survivors and heard from volunteers and members about the centre's mission to rebuild Jewish life in the city. The King used his address at the event to highlight how the world today remains full of turmoil and strife, and how remembering the events of the past is a responsibility everyone must take.
To be in Poland on International Holocaust Remembrance Day, as we commemorate 80 years since the liberation of Auschwitz, is both a somber and indeed a sacred moment. As the number of Holocaust survivors regrettably diminishes with the passage of time, the responsibility of remembrance rests far heavier on our shoulders and on those of generations yet unborn. The act of remembering the evils of the past remains a vital task, and in so doing we inform our present and shape our future.
Susan Pollack was just 13 years old when she was deported from Hungary and sent to Auschwitz. She was separated from her mother and brother as she passed through the gates there. A fellow prisoner quietly told Susan to tell the Nazi guards that she was in fact 15, and that was advice that ended up saving her life. Susan shared her story with me. Can you take me back to when you were 13?
When I was 13.
And Auschwitz, because you started out in Hungary as those anti-Jew laws came in and the story developed as we well know now. You ended up in Auschwitz, separated from your family, and you've described it before as another world with death all around us all the time, which is a statement that stopped me in my tracks, because it's important for people never to forget the horror of that place and what happened there.
We had been put in a camp in Hungary, not in Germany, not in Auschwitz yet. We tried our very best to please. We tried our very best, and in fact, we were desperate for truth, what was going on elsewhere, because we were totally ignorant what was going on in Germany, Nazi Germany, and other countries. And I'm a village person, so we had no knowledge at all.
From Auschwitz, you went on what was called the Death March to Bergen-Belsen. Just to give people listening to this interview some context, you were close to dying, suffering from tuberculosis, typhoid, and malnutrition.